Our teacher this morning comes to us from Madison, his retirement home, but he served for 31 years in the religion department of Bluffton University. He is best known for his work on violence and nonviolence in the theology and especially the implications for the character of God. His 2001 book is entitled The Nonviolent Atonement. And his 2013 book, The Nonviolent God, look at these themes. He is candid about the fact that both violent and nonviolent images of God are in both testaments. And he offers us a way out of these contradictions by declaring there is an arbiter. From within the teachings of the Bible itself, we have a clear basis to decide. And I'll let Denny explain how to do that. He has lectured in various cities throughout the United States, in the Netherlands, the Congo, and Germany. His writings have been influential beyond the Mennonites. His friend from Eastern Mennonite, another theologian, Ted Grimsrud, has called him a peaceful and pugnacious theologian. Denny, we welcome you to reflect on your life and theology. We're happy to have you with Sojourners.
Well, I'm just saying I'm very happy to be here with Sojourners this morning. Can you hear me? Am I okay? Okay, I will proceed. I really wanted to, this morning, I decided I would talk about why theology matters. Sometimes the theology can shape us, but sometimes what's going on out there, whether in church or society or both, that shapes our theology. So I'm just going to pick out some important junctures between the Bible and today that illustrate the way that theology can shape us or in sometimes is shaped. This is a theme that runs through my memoir that some of you have read, but I'm not just repeating the memoir. This is a different kind of outline, a little bit different approach. First point, the first theme that I'll mention is in the early church. If you read in the gospel, in the book of Acts, the apostles were asked, well, in whose name or what gives you the authority to do what you're doing? And what they did was tell a story. They would say, well, there was this guy, Jesus. He lived here and he did things. He had a mission and you guys killed him and God raised him. And we're acting in that name, in the name of the Jesus of that story. Sometimes it was the Acts gives just a bare outline. Other times it's a rather lengthy story with Old Testament background and events of Jesus till they get to the resurrection. This is the story that's expanded in the Gospels. Paul refers to that story in that chapter in Romans when he says, if you reject a general resurrection, then you're also denying the resurrection of Jesus. But if you believe in Jesus' resurrection, you have to believe in the general resurrection. And he prefaces that by referring to the outline of that story of Jesus. So I just say it's very clear that in the early church, when they identified Jesus, they did so by telling his story. And I think it's not an accident that for at least the first couple centuries of Christian history, the church refused to use the sword because they were defined by the narrative of Jesus, which makes clear that Jesus rejected the sword. And so following in that identification of Jesus, the early church did not use the sword. My next thing, let's jump to the 4th century and see how there was a major change in the way that the church was talking about Jesus. Emperor Constantine called a church council to meet at Nicaea in 325. Emperor Theodosius called a council that met in Constantinople in 381. The Council of Nicaea, there had been a dispute about how to refer to Jesus and Jesus' relationship to God. And this council at Nicaea was called to settle that dispute. And what they came up with was a formula that was put in the formula that said that Jesus is the same substance, or a modern translation, one in being with God. And the Council of Constantinople repeated that creed, and with a few minor revisions, but they kept that formula about the same substance or one in being between Jesus and God. And that creed is still in use today in many denominations. Still use that creed. In fact, I think the Catholic Church is having a big celebration this year to celebrate the Nicene Creed. And that creed that says Jesus is same substance or one in being with God is said it's supposedly required to protect the deity of Jesus. Now, you'll note that defining Jesus in that way as one substance with God, same substance as God, is a marked difference from defining Jesus as in terms of his narrative. So what is the impact of that change? Well, let's look at the social context. In 313, Emperor Constantine declared Christianity a legal religion, and he accepted it as his own religion, and he put cross on his shield, and he began running his army and fighting his wars in the name of Jesus. This is the emperor that called the Council of Nicaea that ended up defining Jesus as one substance with the Father. You'll just note that if you define Jesus in terms of his narrative, that includes his rejection of the sword. But if you define Jesus as one substance with the Father, there is no ethical dimension there. The Christians could define Jesus and profess Jesus and believe in Jesus as one substance with the Father and use the sword because there was no contradiction. Constantine could not have endorsed a Christianity that still defined Jesus in terms that included rejecting the sword. So I think that very much the social evolution of the church and its accommodation of imperial authority had a clear impact on the theology of what came to be the standard theology of the church. It was a church that now could define Jesus in a way that accepted the sword. And without going into it, I think that the language, the standard language of Trinity, defining God comes in threes, and defining Jesus as one person, as a second person of that Trinity, and then the later formula that defined Jesus as truly God and truly man. These are all part of that same package of a way to define the basis of the Christian theology in a way that accepted the sword. So I think to me, it's very clear the impact that social evolution had on the theology on standard Christian theology. Now I'll talk a little bit about atonement theology. There is a standard common view of atonement theology called satisfaction or substitutionary, and it's very familiar. God, or human beings have sinned. We sinned against God, or we sinned against God's law, and therefore there needs to be some kind of punishment or satisfaction of the law. And as small, finite beings, we can't pay our own penalty. And so God sent Jesus to die in our place to pay the penalty that God needed, or that God's law needed. There are multiple versions of this. when you think about the penalty satisfied, then there's a version, there's several versions called satisfaction atonement. When you think about Jesus dying on our behalf, so we didn't have to pay the penalty, then you can talk about substitutionary atonement. There are multiple versions of this. There are a number of logical and theological critiques of this view that I won't go into now. I'll just say, what is the impact of this kind of theology? Well, I think it produces a passivity. Jesus submitted to suffering and death, unjust suffering and death, because his Father needed it. This theology became a model, was appealed to for enslaved people to submit to their masters, even when the master was very unjust. And specifically appealing to the image of Jesus, who submitted to unjust suffering. Women have been encouraged to submit to abuse from a husband or a father on the model of Jesus, who submitted to unjust suffering. I think there's probably even an impact on my boyhood church that believed in non-resistance, not responding. We were following the model of Jesus, who submitted to abuse. So I think that there's very clearly a dimension of standard atonement theology that impacts a behavior for some people. Now, real question is, I'm not done talking about the impact of social issues on theology. The question is, where did satisfaction atonement come from? Where did it come from? The first complete statement of this version of atonement was from Anselm, the Archbishop of Canterbury, in his book Why the God Man, published in 1099, 1100 years after Jesus. So satisfaction atonement is very definitely a medieval version. Now, so it reflects its context. Its context was feudalism. The feudal lord had control over his territory. The vassals under him owed allegiance and obedience to the feudal lord. And order in society depended on the ability of the lord to keep order, depended on that lord being able to, when there was an offense against him, or basically him, when there was an offense, order in society depended on the Lord's ability to either punish or exact satisfaction. Anselm was a bishop, Archbishop of Canterbury, and Anselm considered the king and the bishop the ruler of the church, the two feudal lords who could demand satisfaction. And so it's very clear that Anselm just defined God in terms of the ultimate feudal lord. And so human sin has offended God, and that has disturbed the order of the universe. And for the order in the universe to be restored, God has to be able to exact satisfaction. And so God sent Jesus as the God-man, as the God. Jesus was identified for all of us. And as divine, as God, his death was infinite, and that could pay the penalty that God needed to restore order in the universe. So very clearly, here you have an example of society shaping theology. And in a way, I think maybe Anselm's book is the most influential book ever in history, because his view of atonement is still with us, in that many Christian denominations, many Christians still espouse it in some form or other. And it's also with us in our criminal justice system. Except that in our system today, the people have been replaced by the feudal lord. And so when somebody, you hear the language of trials, the prosecuting attorney often mentions he speaks for, or she speaks for, the people. When somebody is found guilty, that person must pay a debt to society. So it's society, it's the people who are now in the position of the feudal lord to whom satisfaction is paid when somebody commits a crime. We even saw that yesterday at the No Kings March. There was I saw a lot of, when I was at the march, I saw a lot of signs about we the people rule, not the king. Well, the king or the government rules in the name of the people, because the people is now in charge. In the way in Anselm's feudalism, the bishop and the king were in charge. Now, a very different kind of place that theology matters is the church in which I grew up in. Now, some of you, or maybe many of you, will remember this. I really believed, my church really believed in following Jesus. And one of the key Bible verses that it was still stuck in my mind is that ye resist not evil, Matthew 5:38. Someone, resist not evil. And we had the examples of turn the other cheek and give the cloak with the coat, give your cloak with the coat. If somebody asks, go the second mile. And these were interpreted as don't do anything if somebody strikes you. If you get sued, just give everything. Don't respond. Just give everything. Second mile, always do much more than is required, because you're following Jesus and being non-resistant, being absolutely passive in terms of any kind of aggression. So I remember that we might consider, I considered that racial segregation and discrimination against people of color was wrong, but Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights March, they were resisting, even if it was a supposedly nonviolent resistance, it was still resistance. So it was a way station towards greater violence. And so I thought that Martin Luther King was wrong, and excuse me, it wasn't fair, but it was just the way it was. If Black people wanted to be good followers of Jesus, they would just have to submit to that unjust segregation if they really followed up what Jesus did, what Jesus said about being non-resistant. Another big no-no was labor unions, because labor unions went on strike, and the strike was resisting. It was forcing employers to do things they might not want to do. And so that kind of force was wrong. So when I had a job in an ice plant in college, in summers in college, and they asked me, did I want to join the union? And I said, no. I didn't say why, but I was non-resistant. So I was willing to take lesser pay to maintain my belief in non-resistance. Injustices could be real, but following Jesus meant accepting that injustice rather than resisting. So that was a clear sense of one view of understanding the Bible clearly impacted how we lived, how we thought about living in the world. One of the things that changed my view on many things was the time we spent in Algeria with Mennonite Central Committee. We arrived in Algeria after a year of French study. We arrived in Algeria in 1966, which was 3 years after, just 3 years into Algeria being independent from France. And so the young Algerian people that we knew, our neighbor right across in the building right across the street from us, he had stories about the resistance. And it could tell the Algerians were very proud of their 7-year war against France, 7-year guerrilla war against France, because in their minds, they had fought a war of independence and they won. And I wasn't about to say that, yes, violence is right, but it suddenly hit me very hard that if I was supposed to give a Christian witness to these folks, non-resistance meant absolutely nothing. Non-resistance to them, Christian non-resistance to them meant submit to that evil French colonial occupier. I just realized I didn't have a real good answer at the time, but I just realized we need to do better than talking about non-resistance. So I just say that is one place where what was happening in the big world had an impact on how I was starting to think about theology. When I started my career, well, actually, I spent 1 year at Goshen. In that career, I had to teach theology, and I had not studied very much theology. I had been, Reformation historian in graduate school, and so I had to teach a theology class. And I asked my colleagues, "Is there an Anabaptist or a Mennonite way to talk about theology?" And that was the epoch when Anabaptism was very popular. And there was an Anabaptist view of everything, on everything. And the joke was even on basket weaving. And so I asked my colleagues, is there an Anabaptist way or a Mennonite way to talk about these theological issues about Trinity and whatever else? And I thought they'd say, oh, sure, just go read this article or go read this book. And what they said was, I don't know. And that kind of surprised me. And so without really knowing what I was doing, I started to, I never got away from that question. And when I started to talk about who Jesus was, I started talking about Christology, and I came across and learned about that shift in the way of talking about Jesus from the narrative in the book of Acts and the Gospels to the generic categories of deity and humanity in the 4th century, I started to say, oh, maybe there is an Anabaptist way to talk about this. And if we be more biblical rather than 4th century philosophical categories. So I started to say a Mennonite way, an Anabaptist way to talk about Jesus would be to return and start defining Jesus in terms of the narrative again. Is that the narrative is our foundation rather than that generic category that came out of the 1st century, rather than came out of the 4th century church. And when they started to define Jesus in terms of the narrative, the whole way I looked at Jesus turned around, because I no longer saw a pacifist Jesus, a passive Jesus. Jesus was still rejecting the sword, but Jesus was far from passive. He healed on the Sabbath. And now I just can't get away from that story about healing the withered hand on the Sabbath. There's another text a little later on where it even talks about the Pharisees told him, well, why don't you just wait till Monday? Wait till the next day, and then you could do your good deed and you wouldn't have to violate the Sabbath. But Jesus deliberately healed on the Sabbath. It says how he called the guy to come and stand by him. And then it says he looked around at all of them. In other words, he made eye contact with all the people around him, made sure that they saw what he was doing. That's the point he said, stretch out your hand. So, I mean, you start to see a Jesus who is very clearly an assertive person, an activist person. He claimed to be able to forgive sins, to pronounce sins forgiven. That was a pretty radical thing, because you were supposed to, in that time, you were supposed to go to for forgiveness of sins, you were supposed to go to the temple and have an animal sacrifice. And here Jesus was defying that. He supported Samaritans when they were discriminated against, and he raised the status of women. You have that story of the cleansing of the temple, a very visible, assertive public action. So you see, when now you have an activist Jesus. And I learned about, it was one of the revolutionary things when I learned about what Walter Wink said about those famous texts about turn the other cheek, give the cloak with the coat, and go the second mile. And this is Walter Wink. When Matthew says, when somebody strikes you on the right cheek, think about it. And they did not use the left hand. The left hand was the unclean hand. And so the only way you can get to the right cheek is with a backhand slap. And the backhand slap is a slap that is not designed to injure, it's designed to insult, a superior insulting an inferior. And so by turning the other cheek, you're simply refusing the insult and asserting the equality. And it puts the aggressor in a difficult position. If the aggressor strikes again, he is lost by treating the person he's trying to insult as an equal, or he loses face because he can't do anything because the insult was not accepted. The cloak with the coat, the setting for that is the debtor's court. And the poor tenant farmer who has a debt that there's no way he can pay, so he has to show up and say, I can't pay, and he has to give security, and the security might be, the only thing he has is the warm coat that he sleeps in, and he has to give that for security. And there's a couple places back in Leviticus and Deuteronomy that actually mentions this and says that he can get it back in the evening to sleep before he has to give it back in the morning. So when Jesus says they haul you into court with this unjust debt, they haul you into court and ask for your coat for security, just hand him your underwear too. Walk around naked all day. Because in that context, being naked was not shameful. The shame fell on the person who caused the nakedness. And so giving the coat with the cloak with the coat was a very visible way to expose an unjust economic situation. Again, it's an assertive, visible way. It's not a passive way to just give away, do whatever somebody asks you to give away. Going the second mile, the setting is the Roman soldiers' authority. They could commandeer any peasant at any time to carry their 60 to 80 pound pack. But they were relatively enlightened occupiers, so they put limits on how far that could go. They only have him go 1 mile, and then he can go back to his job. You're not going to take him away from his job all day. And so Jesus said, if they compel you to go a mile, go the second mile, because then you got the guy breaking his own regulations, and maybe he'll even beg you to put it down before he gets in trouble. So again, going the second mile is not a statement about being a doormat. It's another way, another visible way to turn the tables on from a supposed social inferior to turn the tables on a superior. And so when I started talking about Jesus as defined by the narrative, when you look at the whole narrative, you start to see a very activist Jesus. And I went from there to defining a new version of atonement. And it's the nonviolent atonement, which is based on a narrative of Jesus confronting evil powers, and evil powers killed him, and God raised him. And so it calls us to identify, it calls us to engage in that same kind of confrontation of evil in the faith that is really the reign of God visible in the world, confronting evil with victory. We hope in the resurrection. And so then that's how I got to an atonement image that I thought fit Anabaptist Mennonite Church, that always said we lived in the story of Jesus. Now, at that point, I still thought I was talking to Mennonites. I still thought I was talking to my Peace Church, and I've run in my career. I run into several things that really markedly, in a very short time, changed my entire worldview, and this is one of those. Because when I had worked this out, and I had this view of atonement and this way to approach Christology, I thought I was talking to Mennonites, and I looked at us as a small sideline to the big majority, and I wondered if there's any other outside minority group, how they might look at this. And I had a course 20 years earlier. I'd had a course in seminary and I learned that there was in the Black church, and I had learned the name James Cone, and I'd learned that Black theology existed. So I went to the library and I got a book by James Cone called God of the Oppressed. And what I read in God of the Oppressed, it really just shocked me. I was still consider myself pretty new in theology at that point. And I had a hard time believing that I really understood what James Cone had said, because he made the same critique of those generic philosophical categories of Jesus that I did, except where I had said, excuse me, where I had said those categories tolerated the sword, enabled Christians to profess Jesus and use the sword. Cone said that those same generic categories allowed Christians to profess Jesus and own slaves, be slave owners. And the solution that he had was let's talk about Jesus. Let's talk about the narrative of Jesus. And he used that activism to define Jesus as liberator. And he had the same critique of standard satisfaction atonement that I did. And he suggested that the answer was an activist, nonviolent narrative, Christus Victor atonement, parallel to what I had done. And it was shocking to me to think that I was discovering making the same kind of observations as the great James Cone, who was a founder of the Black theology movement. And I actually looked for James Cone. Excuse me again. I actually looked for James Cone at a meeting of American Academy of Religion. And I made an opportunity to talk with him briefly. And I asked him if my observations were correct. And he said, well, of course they are. But you're not saying anything that we in the Black community don't already know. And I muttered about, oh, well, then I guess I don't need to say much because you've already said it. And he said, oh, no. He said, oh, no. You're one of the few white folks who know. You go tell the white folks. Now, that wasn't why I kept doing what I was doing, but I've always had that ringing in my ears. And the basic thing that I learned from James Cone at that point was that my critique of standard atonement that tolerated the sword and that tolerated racism and slavery was really something that addressed the entire Christian world. And so I I changed the way I was thinking about my audience. I changed the way I was thinking about theology, and I wrote The Nonviolent Atonement as a book that addressed everybody. And I really hoped that my Mennonite Peace Church Anabaptist colleagues would recognize that it was written by and for them on behalf of the entire Christian tradition. Sometimes that was recognized. It was not always recognized, but that's okay. Now I had one other almost as dramatic a revelation with another version of a later version of Black theology, particularly from James J. Cameron Carter and Willie James Jennings. The one I've used most is J. Cameron Carter. But what these men wrote was that the seeds of racism entered the church in the 4th century when Jesus was separated from his Jewishness. They did not mean Jewish ethnicity. They meant the story that began with Abraham through Israel, inherited by Jesus, who expanded it to include all nations. That those people, when they separated Jesus from that narrative and started to define him as God and man, the second person of the Trinity, then Jesus could be elevated to an above history ideal. And it allowed Europeans to define the ideal human in terms of their own white identity. And that is the seeds of racism, when the ideal human was defined by European Christians in terms of their white selves. And that became the basis that allowed the slave trade and racism to develop and fueled the colonial enterprise around the world. And so I add that, yes, and add that connotation to that standard Christology, to those standard formulas that come out of the 4th century. And I end up having other ways to talk about that stuff. You want to talk about how Jesus is related to God, I talk about God is in the story of Jesus, and Jesus' story is God's story. And when we live in that story, we are continuing to make the presence of God, of Jesus and God in the present in the world. I'll stop there. Questions, comments?
I have a microphone for questions or comments. Yes.
I'm Barbara Johnson. I would really like to hear a little bit more about you expand on your atonement theory. I haven't read your book, so maybe that's the answer for me. But I'm very interested in what Jesus did and how you perceive God in that, all of that. It sounds to me as though you're saying that maybe Jesus was confronting the political situation at the time, and that's why he died, in fact, rather than that it was a sacrifice for God's appeasement. And I prefer to think that, but I would like to have you explain a little bit more about that, if you would. Could you?
Okay, you understood correctly. The satisfaction atonement, to me, it makes God a violent God. God needs death or blood, and so God sent Jesus to have the Son killed to satisfy God. So that's a violent God who uses blood, who abuses his own Son for the sake of a divine need. it won't surprise you that the most prominent feminist theologians call that an image of divine child abuse. And I use their language. My book uses their language, and I've been slapped around by conservatives for using the image of God as a divine child abuser. But to me, it makes sense. Another illogical problem of that, you'll notice that God needs the death of Jesus. So the people who killed Jesus are actually giving God what God needs. And so you're supposed to say, oh, the people who killed Jesus were evil, but they also gave God what God needs, namely a death. And so I turn it around and say, and so, Jesus had to die. And you'll notice, and you don't notice it really, but I'll just tell you, there is no mention of resurrection in Satisfaction Atonement. The whole thing is organized around Jesus' death, and resurrection is just something that's in a different part of we believe in a different part of the outline. So, I mean, I think there are a lot of problems that come with Satisfaction Atonement when we unpack it. And so you're right. Jesus, who was a representative on earth, the representative on earth of God and the reign of God, confronted the evil powers, and he died because they killed him, and God raised him from that. And so you don't end up saying God needed that death. In fact, that death was opposed to the will of God, and so Jesus confronted that evil, and resurrection is a victory over the powers of evil. And it was started. I mean, the political powers on earth represent the ultimate evil. I could say, I think that this is visible when you understand this. This is a narrative, Christus Victor. I forgot to say a while ago, Anselm rejected Christus Victor. It was the idea of evil powers defeated in the resurrection of Jesus was an image in the early church theologians, and Anselm rejected it because it had simply become an image of devil in the sky, Satan in the sky, fighting Jesus in the sky, a terrestrial battle. And it had that terrestrial battle had no impact on earth. But that battle is image in Revelation in chapters about 10 through 13 in terms of the dragon and the woman, the beautiful woman, and Jesus. The baby is born, and Jesus is snatched up to heaven. The baby is snatched up to heaven, and there's the big battle up there between the force of good and the force of evil, with victory and the resurrection. But that image didn't mean anything in terms of real world history, and Anselm just rejected it and did something that made sense in terms of his history. But when you go back and understand, we start with that narrative of Jesus, and you see Jesus confronting real world political evil, and which kills him, and Jesus raised him. There is a narrative, Christus Victor. And then you drop down to the end of the Bible to look at Revelation, and you start to understand that the symbols in Revelation really refer to the first century powers that are visible there when the book of Revelation is written. So the symbols in Revelation refer to emperors and the Roman Empire, with victory in the resurrection. And so it's a symbolic, using apocalyptic language. The book of Revelation is another version of the story of Jesus confronting the evil powers in terms of the empire, with victory in the resurrection. So I've got a narrative Christus Victor at each end of the gospel, at each end of the New Testament. And then I found literature that understands Paul in that same way. So I just say this nonviolent atonement, the way I understand it, is really the biblical version of atonement, and it fits our today when we want to be active in confronting the injustices in our society. And
Other
it answers those questions about, well, what about being passive and submitting to evil because Jesus did, and so on.
Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. Who were your Anabaptist conversational partners?
In what way conversation partners?
People you agree with and disagree with, who helped you to come to your unique positions.
I learned about that the early church defined Jesus in terms of a narrative as visible in the book of Acts. I learned about that from John Howard Yoder. I've been supported in what I did by people like Ted Grimsrud and my friend Ray Ginrich at Eastern. Both Ted and Ray were at Eastern Mennonite University. I've been challenged vigorously as, quasi-heretic by Jim Reimer at Conrad Grebel College, Ron Sider, a couple of different places in Pennsylvania. There's some names that people will know. There's other. Some of you might even remember back in 1990, I had a grant from the was it Pew Foundation? I had a grant for a half salary for my sabbatical, and it was a sabbatical when I wrote what became the book, The Nonviolent Atonement. And the title of my grant application, I wanted to get their attention, and I called it Atonement After Divine Child Abuse. And when I got the grant, then the Mennonite Weekly Review, had a story on me and that grant. Bluffton was proud of their boy who got a grant like that. And so there was an article, and there were 3 months of letters to the editor and Mennonite Quarterly Review of people yelling about how terrible it was to have a professor who believed this and this. And then other people started writing in and said, well, wait a minute, it makes sense to me. And why don't you wait until he's actually written something before you pop off? And so there was that controversy before I even wrote anything. So.
Other comments, questions?
Yes.
Well, if not,
Leonard Gross here. I just want to say, Danny, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Leonard. Go ahead.
You're spot on, Danny. And the narrative is of course the essential thing, and is why the Anabaptists cannot create a dogma or a doctrinal approach, a systematic approach. It's not in our blood. And I think the best, the one who wrote most on dogma is Harnack. It's 6 volumes. He starts out by saying, there is no dogma, there is no doctrine in the New Testament. That comes later. And he still goes on and then, of course, historically, walks right through all of that. But we as Anabaptists go back to the narrative. So for us, the best thing we can do is simply talk about these further developments in dogma historically. So again, thank you, Dennis.
Yeah, no, thank you, Leonard. I wanted to make a commercial. This is the 500th year of Anabaptism. It started with young men who got frustrated with their authorities, who would not move as fast as they wanted them to move. And they started a movement, which was a radical movement. It was challenging the state church, which was really a challenge to political authorities, because it was the political authorities who enforced church doctrine. And so this was a radical political movement that developed the idea that it was based on the Bible, based on following Jesus, an example of Jesus. I think we have a modern equivalent. That modern equivalent is Mennonite Action. One of the two founders of Mennonite Action, Adam Raymer, actually grew up in the Madison Mennonite Church. And so I can even take a slight bit of credit for Adam, because to me, Adam and his partner are the parallel to our 16th century young men who got frustrated when their leaders wouldn't move. Adam was working for Congressman Ro Khanna, who refused to sign the call for a ceasefire in Gaza. And Adam just got frustrated and left and wanted to do something that reflected his Mennonite idea of working for social justice. And the result is Mennonite Action. And I was very proud, not a good word here maybe, but I was very proud to be asked to give a statement at their first, the very first Zoom call they had that had 800 and some people on it, when they called for the organization of Mennonite Action to support Palestinians. And so I see Mennonite Action as the modern equivalent of Conrad Grebel and Felix Mons, who initiated that challenge to political authority in the 16th century. These guys started Mennonite Action as a challenge to political authority today. And I think they are right on. I think they are the church.
I'd like to say also, in the same vein as a kind of commercial, we do have a bookstore in town, Fables, and you could have more exploration of some of these ideas if you buy one of Denny's books there. If you'd like to try it out first, we have in our Goshen College Library these books. We have in the Mennonite Historical Library these books, and we have the Goshen Public Library, Denny Weaver's books. So we have had 35, 40 minutes, but if you want 300 pages or more, you can explore by perusing one of his books. Let's show our appreciation to Denny for his work. Thank you so much, Denny.
It's been a pleasure. I'm just glad to be invited.